And so the Babylons are now in power. Briefly, what happens after that is the Babylonians rise to power, they take over. Then they're defeated by the Persians. The Persian king was amazing at that stage. His philosophy was if he gets the smaller nations to like him, it'll be easier to control them. And so he acts a bit like Father Christmas. He says to them, go back to your late nations, rebuild them, I'll finance it, I'll help you. He supports them in rebuilding the temple. He supports them in going back. And so the period of exile is over. After that, the Greeks sweep in and take control, and we don't hear much of that in the Old Testament. And then it's the Romans, and Jesus arrives on the scene. And that's the history briefly of the Old Testament. And so just like where I ran out of petrol, the time differed. So if it was the morning or the evening, the response would be different. It's the same with the Old Testament. You see, if somebody wrote a passage, if a prophet spoke a message, if a poem was written when the Israelites were doing well under King David, it would be completely different to if it was in their period of exile where all these world nations are just wiping them out. It would be completely different in the dark ages where they're wandering in the desert versus in the time of the prophets where they've gone back and are rebuilding the temple. You see, the time makes a difference as to what we read. And the message that God would give to the people would be different based on when it is. So that deals with the when, but the same thing is the where. Now, sometimes what we do in the Middle East, not the Middle East, but in the Middle Ages, what they did is, a lot of the artists did this, is they would paint biblical characters wearing medieval clothing. And obviously we know that's not true, but sometimes when reading scripture, we forget where it happened. It wasn't in South Africa or America or Europe, it was in the Middle East. And it wasn't in all of the Middle East, it was in one small little part. If you look in your notes, you'll see I printed or I put in a map. And the part where all of this history happens was what we call the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent was a tiny slither in the Middle East where this happens. It was known as the Fertile Crescent because it had so many rivers that ran through it, because it was surrounded by mountains on the one side, a desert on the other, and seas on either end. And so it was really one part in a very hostile land where everything grew. And the Israelites and the Judeans, they weren't even in control of the whole of the Fertile Crescent. They just had the tiniest slither within the Fertile Crescent. In fact, their land, the whole area where all of this happens, the area where all of this rich history, the area where Jesus was born, the area that actually changed all of our religion and our history, was so small. It was about the size of the Kruger National Park. Just put that into perspective. Where all of this happens, it was the size of the Kruger National Park. Maybe a little bit bigger, not much. The Fertile Crescent was important because, as you can see, if you have nations all the way around and there's mountains on one side and a desert on the other and surrounded by oceans, you can imagine that every single solitary nation wanted that piece of land. Obviously there would be wars. Obviously the Old Testament would be riddled with wars because everyone was fighting over that one piece of land. The Israelites had even the better land, because within their Fertile Crescent, the little part that they had taken, this promised land, not only was it fertile, not only did it have rivers, but it also had 2 world trade routes. And so everyone who wanted to do trade had to go through them. And you can imagine that would have been so good for the economy of the country, of the nation. And so everyone, the smaller nations, the bigger world powers, they all wanted this piece of land that the Israelites or the Judeans that they had. It was truly the promised land of that time. That's why Deuteronomy describes it as the land on which God smiles, the part where God's eye is always on it. And so that's the place. Yeah, when we read the Old Testament, remember that. Remember that this was fertile ground, that this was a land that everyone wanted, that it had major trade routes, which would make it easier for armies as well. another important part is to remember that people of those days were different to what we are today. You know, even think back, even the way we lived in 2019 was different to the way we live today. But for them, it was even greater. You know, we live in an economy driven by production, driven by technology, driven by science, driven by all of those things. Whereas they didn't live like that. They were an agrarian pastoral society. In other words, what that means is that it was all about agriculture. Their economy thrived, it revolved around agriculture. And not farming like we know it. You know, we think of the farmers where you have a piece of land and that's your piece of land, and then you farm it and you keep your sheep or your cows on that land. No, it was more nomadic, it was more pastoral than that. So what would happen is that you would live in a town, everyone would live there, and then there would be fields that you would own, and you would go plant on those fields, and you couldn't just water it how you liked. It was seasonal. You had to rely on the rains. There were no aqueducts like we know. There were no way of watering the ground other than relying on the rain. And so everything was seasonal. There was a time to plant, a time to harvest, a time to prepare the soil. There was a time to gather. It was all about that. And every religious festival was based on the seasons and the agriculture. In addition to that, not only was it that, but the pastoral part was, if you could have sheep and goats were very popular, but they weren't kept in paddocks or kept on farmlands. The farmers, not the farmers, the shepherds or the herdsmen, they would go out and wander up into the mountains or out into the fields with their animals. Family was the most important unit, because unlike today, the more children you have, the more expensive it is. In those days, the more children you had, the more productive it was. And so large families were considered a blessing, and often families would work together and they would become so close-knit. They would be known as a clan, and clans would become known as a tribe. They would live in the same towns in small quarters, and so get to know each other intimately. They would all meet at the town's gate, and that's where all the meetings happened and the elders met. And then they would go out during the day and work their fields, and every child in the household had a job to do. Every member of the household had a job to do, a task to do. And so the greater the household, the easier life was. The good news of that is that family was the most important part of your life. The bad news is that if you had no family, you had no hope. And so parents who didn't have children would know that as they get older, life would get more difficult and eventually impossible. Children who didn't have parents knew that they were at the mercy of strangers, that the only way of survival was other people's generosity. Widows knew that they had to rely either on their children, but if they didn't have children, they would have to rely on their neighbors. They were the most vulnerable of all society. Which is why the Old Testament has so many rules and laws about them, is because God has a passion to look after the vulnerable. And so you can see life then was very different to life now. It was all about the seasons. It was all about the harvest. It was all about growing what you can. They ate what they could grow. It wasn't like today where you go to a supermarket and buy whatever you like. Not at all. And so that is where and when the Old Testament comes about. Now you might be wondering, and I've been asked this question so many times, who wrote the Old Testament? The answer is not one person. Nobody sat down and went like, okay, now I'm going to write the Old Testament. It evolved over time. It started as oral traditions where families would gather around the fire, or they'd gather around a meal, or they'd gather around a festival, and they would tell the stories of Abraham and Adam and Eve. They would tell the stories of Esther. They would tell all the different stories. And this would pass down from generation to generation to generation, until eventually, and often it was because of a crisis, somebody would decide, or a group of people would decide, we stand the risk of losing this history if we don't record it. And so different groups of people at different stages in Israelite history would write down their record of the history that had been passed down from generation to generation. A lot of it happened in the exile when the Judeans realized that if they don't record it, they're going to lose everything. They've already lost the temple. And they started recording a lot of the history then. Others were written by prophets, that they had messages for specific people at specific time, and they would write them down or they would send letters. And these were collected over the years and kept. They were scrolls that were kept in different places, a lot of them at the temple. And that became what we know as the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible at a later stage was translated into Greek, because when the Greeks took over, they're very clever, and they wanted their Greek culture and Greek language to go everywhere. And so anyone who wasn't Greek was considered a barbarian. Anyone who couldn't speak Greek was considered a barbarian. And so the Greek language became the most popular language. And so the Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek Bible, and some of the books that were on the outskirts of the Bible, or the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, were included in the Greek Bible. And that Greek Bible is still today known as the Roman Catholic Old Testament. Whereas us as Protestants, we follow the Hebrew Bible. So if ever you've seen that the Old Testament of the Roman Catholics has more books than the Old Testament of the Protestants, that's the only reason. It's the only reason. In your notes, you'll see that I've given a bit more detail as to how this worked. But then, what we did as Protestants is we took this Hebrew Bible and we classified it. We said that the first 5 books were really the Pentateuch, which means 5 books. But that's the story all the way through to the exile. Not the exile, sorry, the Exodus. Then after that, we have the story, the historical stories. It's the period of the judges and the kings, right through to the split of the kingdoms, right through to the destruction of the Babylonians. We then have what we call wisdom writings, which is Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Songs. It's those books that have a rich literature, but they don't talk about history and they don't talk about the beginning stages of creation. And then finally, we have our prophets. And that's the order of the Old Testament according to the Protestant Bible. The Hebrew Bible for the Jews is different. The Catholics is the same, but they have additional writings within. And what we're going to do from next week is we'll take each one of these categories. So we'll start with the first 5 books. Then we'll do the historical writings, then the poetic writings or the wisdom literature, and then the prophets. And each week we're going to unpack what happened within those and what it could be saying to us today. And so I just invite you over the next couple of days until we meet on Zoom or online, just invite you to think of questions, to start living into this context, to start reflecting of what life would be like in that time, in the Dark Ages or in the Iron Age, what it would have been like in the exile or in the Exodus. Start thinking of what it would be like to live in a fertile crescent surrounded by desert and mountains. Start thinking what it would have been like where family was the most important part of all life. And every time we unpack an Old Testament story, I'd like to invite you to bear that in mind. Thank you.